Today I am bringing you my top 10 favourite books of 2024. So these are all books that I read this year that I absolutely loved. These aren't necessarily books that were published in 2024. However, I feel like I do have a good balance this year of newer releases and backlist titles. Every year when I sit down to plan this video, I think about doing a top 20 list, or I think about doing a top 5 list for every genre that I read. However, the idea of that feels really intimidating to me, so we're sticking with a top 10 list again. Somehow I have still managed to represent most of the genres that I read within this list. The only genre that I really struggled with this year was contemporary romance. If I had to choose two honourable mentions, I would go with Funny Story by Emily Henry and Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood, because I gave both of those 5 stars, but I didn't feel strongly enough about them to include them within my top 10. I do have a couple of sequels on this list, however all of these reviews are going to be spoiler free, so when I get to those sequels I will just explain the synopsis for the first book and then I'll talk about some general thoughts of the series as a whole. These also aren't in any particular order, although my top book of the year I think is my favourite. So we're just going to start with one of the first 5 stars that I gave out this year, and that was The Devotion of Suspect X by Kigo Higashino. This is one of the most unique crime novels that I've ever read, and I feel like this was a turning point for me in terms of me realising what my taste in thrillers actually is. I don't think I like pure thrillers, I think I like crime novels and I like mystery novels, and this was the perfect blend of the two. In this book we are introduced to this woman who at the very start of the book is involved in this crime, and I think that's all you should know going into the book. A crime is committed and then it flicks to the perspective of the detective who is investigating this crime. So it's a really interesting situation because from the beginning you kind of know what happened, but also you don't know the full story because you are kept in the dark about certain things. But there's something so compelling about following this detective as he's trying to piece together this puzzle. It does still have some thrilling elements. I thought the tension in this was fantastic. It had me on the edge of my seat. So even though it is quite slow in the sense that there's not really much action, I could not put this down. Technically this is part of the series. I believe each book follows this detective as he's investigating a different case in each book. However, I think this works pretty well as a standalone. I would be open to reading other books in this series. If you read them, then please let me know. And also, if you have any other recommendations for translated thrillers, then please let me know in the comments because I loved this. I thought this was so clever. This next book on my list, I always struggle to say because the title is a bit of a tongue twister, but it is Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by Jessie Sutanto. So this is a cozy mystery. However, the reason I loved this was because of the found family element. I feel like that is the main selling point of this book. It does have that cozy vibe, and it also has one of the most iconic characters I have ever read. Vera Wong is a 60-year-old woman who owns a tea shop, and one morning she goes downstairs to find that a man has been killed in her tea shop, and she decides to help the police by doing her own investigation. So you're following her as she is interviewing all of her suspects and working through her list, and it is so cozy, but also the found family in this I thought was done so well. I cried while reading this. I think it was exactly what I needed to read at that time. There is a sequel that's coming out in 2025, which I'm a little bit nervous about because I read another book by this author also this year that ended up one of my most disappointing books of the year. However, because I loved the first Vera Wong book so much, I am going to give it a go and hopefully it will be another 5 stars. It was so funny, it's so heartwarming, and I also really liked the audiobook for this. I can remember the narration was really engaging, so if you are thinking about picking this up, would recommend the audiobook. Next up we have The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent, which funnily enough I said in my January wrap-up that I thought this was going to be my favourite book of the year, and it's not quite my favourite, however it is one of my favourites. This is a fantasy romance which in my opinion has the perfect blend of fantasy and romance. We're following this woman called Araya, who is the human daughter of the Vampire King. In this book she decides to enter a competition where the winner is going to be granted a wish by the goddess of death. Araya soon finds that she is kind of out of her depth because she is competing in this competition against these big scary vampires who are much stronger than her. However, she's also kind of used to this because she has grown up at court surrounded by vampires who could kill her at any moment. The only reason they don't is because she's the adopted daughter character of the king. The pacing in this is perfect because it's structured around these trials, but there's also slower parts where you can see the romance really start to develop, and I love the way that Carissa Broadbent writes tension. This was the perfect slow burn. The world is also really interesting. I loved learning about the politics of this world involving these different vampire houses. It is dark and brutal and violent, so be prepared for that, but overall this was pretty much my perfect fantasy romance. The stakes felt high and the characters, I think, were characters that you can really root for. Also, this has such an intense ending that you are immediately going to want to pick up book 2. Next up we have the Rook and Rose trilogy by M.A. Carrick, but specifically I'm putting The Liar's Knot on my list, which is book 2. Book 1 is The Mask of Mirrors, so I will tell you the synopsis of this particular book and also hopefully get across the vibe of this series, because this has become one of my favourite fantasy series of all time. There's a few different characters that you're following. I would say that there are 3 main characters in this series, but the main character is called Ren, and she is a con artist who is trying to infiltrate a noble family in order to secure a fortune for her and her sister. This does actually have some really interesting commentary on family and whether family is something that you choose or something that you are born into. There's different cultures within this city and within this wider world, even though the story is very much focused on this one city, which has a very complicated history. At one point in the past it was colonized, and in the present day it's home to a few different groups of people, and there's this tension between these different groups. These different groups have different beliefs, and there are several different magic systems that come into play. I loved the setting in this. I thought it was very immersive. I think if you liked the setting in The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch, then this setting could also work for you, because it is that Venetian inspired setting where you have canals and people travel by boats. It's very political, and I can see some people finding it a little bit tedious and slow, but I loved how intricate everything was. From what I remember, I don't think there's any romance in the first book. However, this does have several LGBTQ characters, and the romances that do build over the course of the series I did feel invested in, and I thought they were done well. The characters felt complex and interesting. They have so much depth, and they go through a lot of growth over the course of the series, which felt really satisfying. If world building and an interesting, unique world is something that's important to you, then I would really recommend this series. Okay, if the camera angle has changed slightly, it's because I just had to delete some stuff off my memory card and also change out the camera battery. But next on my list we have The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve Dew. This I would describe as historical fiction with horror and paranormal elements. It follows 2 siblings in the 1950s in Florida. Robert is a 12-year-old boy who at the start of this book is sent to prison. It calls itself a school, but it's basically a prison, and he's sent there because he kicks a white boy while defending his sister. So you follow Robert, but you also follow Gloria as she is desperately trying to get him out of this situation. The beginning of this is quite slow, however I felt like that was needed to really establish these characters and make you really feel for them. This was heartbreaking. There are certain scenes in this that are so intense, I cannot stop thinking about this book. It's very emotional, but it never feels like Tanana Reeve Dew is going into more detail than is necessary. I think she is such a talented writer in being able to make you understand the abuse that these boys are going through at this reformatory, but not stating stuff in explicit or overly explicit detail. The ending to this had me gripped. I felt sick, I felt anxious, I cried, and I would also really recommend reading the author's note at the end, because Tanana Reeve Dew explains how this is linked to real history. It's a book that I will be thinking about for a very long time, and I have since recommended this to so many people. It is nearly 600 pages, however I think that page length was needed in order to really do this story justice. Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll is the next book on my list. This is a literary crime novel that is inspired by real events. It's set in the 1970s and it follows a couple of characters, but the main character that you're introduced to is Pamela, and she is the president of her sorority when a man breaks in the middle of the night, kills 2 women and injures several others. We follow Pamela in the days and weeks following this traumatic event, and we see how the police constantly undermine her testimony. She's also approached by a woman called Tina who believes that there are links to a woman who went missing several years earlier. This made me feel so many emotions. I cried while I was reading it. It also made me feel angry and frustrated at the way that these women were treated and the victim blaming. Above all else though, what I really appreciated was how this challenged the narrative around serial killers, how it suits the police if the media portrays these killers as being super smart and charismatic. This presents an argument for maybe that's not the case. Maybe they get away with it because of police incompetencies or because of society's expectations of women and how women should behave. It was so frustrating to read, but in a really deliberate and intentional way. It's not a thriller, and I think it's really important to go into it not expecting a thriller. It is more about the themes and it is more of a literary novel. However, if that sounds like your kind of thing, then I would strongly recommend this. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is the next book on my list, and who would have thought that I would be putting a classic on my favourites list in 2024. I only read, I think, 2 classics in 2024. I've probably read less than 5 classics in the last 5 years, but this was incredible. If you read thrillers or if you read anything that's kind of thriller adjacent, then I would really recommend reading Rebecca if you haven't already, because I could see how modern day authors have possibly been inspired by Rebecca or by Daphne du Maurier's writing. I'm sure a lot of people already know the synopsis for Rebecca, but in this we are following a young woman who has this whirlwind romance with a man who sweeps her off her feet and takes her back to his estate called Mandalay. And I know that I'm pronouncing Mandalay wrong. I think it's actually pronounced Mandalay, but I always pronounce it as Mandalay, and I just think it sounds better. So sorry, not sorry. This has a lot of interesting commentary on class differences. The main character is quite a bit younger than her husband, and I just thought the way that this built the tension and the atmosphere was so impressive. I loved the way that this took you inside the mind of the main character and how you're constantly questioning, are people actually treating her the way that she thinks they're treating her, or is it just because we're in her head and we're isolated in her head and she's feeling so out of her depth? I could see myself rereading this, and I don't say that often. There was one chapter in particular where I knew we were building up to something. I knew it was coming, and it was so awkward, but I couldn't look away. The way the author also contrasts the two Mrs. De Winters. One of the big themes in this is how our main character, who is never named throughout the novel, she feels like she's living in the shadow of her husband's previous wife who died the year before. This did not go in the direction that I was expecting. I've never seen an adaptation of Rebecca, so I had no idea what to expect, but I loved the ending of this. It does end quite abruptly, so I think you have to be prepared for that, but yeah, it was just so impactful, and it has inspired me to pick up more classics. This had been on my radar for a while because I know it is one of the original, I think it's one of the original Gothic classics, or it's a book that a lot of people recommend if you like Gothic stories, and I am now one of them. I would really recommend this if you like Gothic stories and you haven't yet read this. I'm not going to talk about this next book too much because it is the last book in a very long series and it's very difficult to talk about without spoilers, but I could not make a 2024 favourites list without including Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. This is the final book in the Realm of the Outlands, which is a very long series. I think this is actually book 16, if I've counted right, and these books are not short. This is one of the longest books that I read this year, but there is something so satisfying about reading the final book in a series that first of all is very long, but also it's a series that I had been reading for years. I think I read Assassin's Apprentice back in 2021. Throughout this series, you're following a main character called Fitz, and when you first meet him, he's 6 years old. By the time you get to this book, he's approaching old age, and there's discussions about aging. He's reflecting on his life and processing the trauma that he's been through. Robin Hobb is such an incredible character writer, and this series, this entire series of the Realm of the Outlands, is very slow. You have to be okay with character-driven fantasy. There's one book where I can remember literally half of the book is just a long conversation between characters, so if that sounds like something that you would find tedious and boring, then this isn't going to be the series for you. But if you love that slow journey of getting to know characters and seeing all of their thoughts and feelings so they feel like real people, then you need to read The Realm of the Outlands. Okay, we're down to the top 2, and in second place we have Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I read another book by this author in, I think it was 2022, 2022. I read Kindred and it was one of my favourite books of that year. So I went into this with high expectations. However, this more than exceeded my expectations. It's a hard-hitting dystopian that was written in the 1990s. However, it is set in the 2020s, and it was a fascinating exploration of what the author predicted the world was going to look like in 2024. The book actually starts in 2024. I think if you like TV shows like The Walking Dead or The Last of Us, not because of the zombies, but because of the way that it looks at humanity and how humanity are dealing with a situation, I think you will really enjoy this. We're following Lauren, who lives in one of the last safe communities in California. It's a gated community, kind of similar to what you would expect in one of those TV shows, and she hears the adults in her life talking about how the situation in the world is just temporary. There's a drought, so water is really expensive. The police and the government are corrupt. Vigilantes roam the streets, and so it is really not that safe to go out of this compound. Lauren hears the adults in her life talking about the situation and she disagrees. She thinks they need to get used to this new normal and adapt, and she decides to form a religion and makes plans to leave this community to spread the word about this religion. This does have some hard-hitting themes and it feels very bleak in terms of the tone. There were also moments of hope. So Lauren has something called hyper-empathy, which is exactly what it sounds like. She can feel other people's emotions. Society has reached a point where most people don't trust other people, and there were some really powerful moments in this that I thought were just fantastically written. I listened to the audiobook for this, which I would recommend. It is written as if you are reading or listening to Lauren's diary. I'll just hold up the first page so you can see. So I felt like Lauren was a real person. I felt so invested in her journey. I now need to go back and read Octavia Butler's entire backlist because I've given every single book of hers that I've read 5 stars so far. I keep running out of space on my memory card, but I only have one more book left to talk about, and that is my favourite book of the year, The Measure by Nikki Ehrlich. So this is speculative fiction, and something that I really love is when an author takes a concept and they explore everything to do with that concept. So The Measure looks at what the world would look like if everyone woke up one morning to find a little box outside their front door or next to them. This box says the measure of your life, and inside is a piece of string which scientists soon work out tells you how long you're going to live for. Some people decide to open their boxes, some people decide not to, and some people have no choice. There's not really much plot. It is very much about this concept. You're following a few different characters and you're seeing the decisions that they make, but you're also seeing the wider picture and how governments react. There's a political campaign in the US and you're seeing how that's affected. There's also a big focus on discrimination, and I thought that was handled in such an interesting way. I loved how this looked at the societal and political ramifications and not just how it affected individuals. It also hits differently when you've been through a life-threatening illness and you can relate to some of the characters' thoughts and feelings. I read this around my 5-year remission anniversary and it really affected me more than I was expecting. It's become one of my favourite books of all time, and I feel like that is a good place to end this video. So thank you for watching if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Let me know some of your favourite books of 2024. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye.